Let me guess. You just bought the core box of Marvel Champions and thought that instead of reading the rulebook, why not go to YouTube for a quick explanation video? Well, if that's you, then you clicked on the white thumbnail. I am going to guide you through the first round and explain everything you need to know in order to play this great game. But before you can sit down and start your first match, you not only have to build your own deck, you also have to build the deck of the villain you will face. Both of these steps are not being discussed here, but I still got you. Because this video is the third and last video of our short tutorial series that gets you ready and started. So if one of these other topics interests you, you can find a link to them in the description and at the end of the video. But even if you do already know how to build all these decks, you still can't just hop into your first match. That is because before every game you have to set it up. This procedure is its own phase of the game since it varies slightly depending on which identity you play and which scenario you choose to face. Let's go through all the steps of setup together so you know what you have to do, no matter what combination of heroes and villains you are choosing. If you already know how to set up the match, then feel free to use the timestamps of this video and hop forward to the beginning of the player phase. Fantasy Flight Games, the creators of Marvel Champions, have released several revised reference guides over the lifespan of the game. In the core set, that's the orange booklet. The current one at the time of recording is Reference Guide 1.7, released in December 2025. In there you can find the step-by-step setup procedure, and as you can see there are 16 steps. That's quite a lot, but don't worry, with a little bit of practice, setup is quite fast. Now we simply go through them one by one. Number 1. Select identities. Each player selects one identity, placing their alter ego side face up. We already choose Spider-Man aka Peter Parker as our identity in the second video of this series. Thus, we are going to put Peter Parker on the field now. 2. Set hit points. Each player notes the starting hit points of their character. You can find them on the bottom left of both sides of your identity. The core set comes with a couple of useful dials for this exact purpose. So, we are going to set our dial to 10, since Peter Parker starts with 10 hit points. 3. Select first player. This step only matters if you're playing in a group or if you decide to play two-handed. Just decide who the first player of round 1 will be. That player starts the first turn. The core set includes a token you can use to mark the first player. After each round, the first player passes clockwise. 4. Set aside obligations. For each identity being played, set aside the obligation card. If you build all decks with the help of my videos, you already did this step, as well as the next step. 5. Set aside nemesis sets. 6. Shuffle player decks. If your deck contains any cards with the keywords permanent and or setup, make sure to not shuffle them into the deck, since you will have to play them out before the game starts anyway, so spare yourself from the hassle. 7. Collect tokens and status cards. The core set comes with a lot of different accessories, just make sure that everyone has access to them. 8. Select scenario. Select a scenario and put its villain deck and main scheme deck into play near the center of the play area. In the first video of this series, we choose to play against the Rhino scenario. So now we have to take all the cards of the villain deck, in our case Rhino 1 and Rhino 2, and place them so that the villain card with the lower Roman numeral is face up on top of the villain deck, and the higher one is face up underneath it. Next to it, we place the main scheme deck so that all cards show their A side, stacked in ascending order with the lowest number on top. In our case, it's just one card, the break-in. 9. Set the villain's hit points. Just like with your identity, you find them at the bottom of the villain card. Pay attention to the symbol next to the number. Whenever you see that symbol next to a value, you multiply that value by the number of players in the game. Since we are playing solo, we multiply by 1, which means Rhino has 14 hit points. In a game with 2 players, he'd have 14 times 2, so 28 hit points. The core box also includes a large hit point die that you can use for this. 10. Create the encounter deck. This we covered extensively in the first video of this series, so if you are not sure how to do this, then give that video a watch. Make sure that you don't forget to add the obligation card to the encounter deck that you just put aside in step 4 of setup. Put the encounter deck next to the villain's deck. I'd recommend waiting a little before shuffling the encounter deck. You'll see why in a second, but officially you do it now. 11. Put setup cards into play. Search each deck and all cards you set aside in earlier steps for any cards that say setup. Put all of them into play. In our case, there are none. If you would have chosen to play with a standard 3 model for example, we would now put Pursued by the Past into play. 12. Resolve scenario setup and when revealed abilities. A. Now follow the instructions under setup on your first main scheme. In our case, we are only instructed to flip the main scheme to its other side, but in other scenarios there can be a lot more. Take Ultron for example. You are told to put the Ultron drone's environment into play and then shuffle the encounter deck. Or for Claw, you are told to put the defense network side scheme into play and shuffle the encounter deck. That's why I always recommend reading what the scenario makes you do during setup before you shuffle the encounter deck. If you already know you are going to put Ultron drones or defense network into play before the game starts, there's no point shuffling them into the encounter deck first. Sometimes the cards you put into play during this step will immediately tell you to do additional things. You have to reserve that now before you move on. Defense network, for example, tells you to place one additional threat on it per player. I'll explain what that means later in this video. What matters here is that you don't miss these instructions. B. The last instruction on the A side of the main scheme is always to advance to section 1B. That means you flip the card to its B side. There may be one or more when we read effects there, reserve them in order. For the break-in, there are none. But if you look at the Claw scenario, the B side of Underground Distribution does have a when we read effect. You would reserve that now. And again, if that when we read ability would lead to trigger even more abilities, those would reserve now as well. C. Once that's done, you are finished with the main scheme and move to the villain. First, reserve any setup abilities on the villain. Then reserve any when we read effects. In our case, neither applies. But imagine we had chosen expert instead of standard. Then Wino 2 would be the revered villain. And if we look at him, we see he has a when we read ability. We'd reserve it now. We'd search the encounter deck for the side scheme Breakin' and Taken and put it into play. Again, cards that enter play this way may tell you to do additional things and you reserve those in order. 13. Campaign setup. This step only matters if you are playing a campaign. Campaign mode isn't available in the core set, but most expansions include it. In campaigns, each scenario has additional setup rules for each game in the ongoing campaign. Explained step by step in the campaign rules. Reserve those now. We skip this because we're not playing a campaign. 14. Now it's finally time to draw your starting hand. You draw as many cards as the number next to hand size in the bottom left of your identity card indicates, keeping in mind that you always start the game in alter ego form. In our case, we start as Peter Parker, not Spider-Man. So we draw 6 cards. Under specific circumstances, mostly in campaigns, your hand size can be modified, meaning you could draw more or fewer cards than what's printed. But for our example, no hand size modification applies. 15. Resolve Mulligan. Now you may discard as many of the cards you just drew as you want, and then draw back up to your hand size. Keep in mind, you can only do this once. You can't discard 2, draw 2, then discard 3 more and draw again. Also, cards you discarded this way do not get shuffled back into your deck. Discarded cards stay discarded. But don't worry, our champions is designed around cycling your deck multiple times in a game. When you draw the last card of your deck, you don't lose. Instead, you shuffle your discard pile to form a new deck. 16. The final step is to reserve all setup abilities on all player cards in play. Usually, that's only your alter ego identity. But there might be more. In our example, nothing happens because we only have Peter Parker in play, and he doesn't have the setup ability. But if you look at Black Panther, aka T'Challa, we can see what the setup ability looks like. In this step, you are instructed to search your deck for a Black Panther upgrade and add it to your hand. That means T'Challa usually starts round 1 with 7 cards in hand instead of 6, unless you are unlucky and all your Black Panther upgrades are already in your opening hand. There are also cases where you might not be able to fully reserve a setup instruction. The all upgrades already in hand case is one example, but you can build an even more interesting example with Captain America aka Steve Rogers. He tells you to find Captain America's shield in your deck or discard pile and add it to your hand. If you are playing against Ultron, the 1B side of the main scheme tells you to put the top card of your deck into play face down as a drone minion. Since that happens earlier in setup than Steve Rogers' setup step, it's possible that Captain America's shield is exactly the card that's now a drone against you. In that case, you can't resolve Steve Rogers' setup effect. As the rulebook says best, the game is now ready to begin. So, let's not waste any more time and jump right into it. In the core set you can find 2 cards explaining all steps of the player phase and the villain phase. There you can find all the information you need. For the rest of this video I will play through the first player phase and villain's phase and explain everything you need to know so you can play a complete match. This is our starting hand. I will go through all the cards just in a moment, but before that let us take a look at all the options we can take while it's our turn. The first option listed on the reference card is to play cards. How do we do that? If we take a closer look at the cards in our hand, we can see that most of them have a large number on the top left hand corner. This is their cost. Take Black Cat for example. In order to play her, we have to pay the cost of 2. How do we pay that cost? Well, we do that with resources. There are a couple of ways to generate resources, but by far the most common one is to use other cards in our hand for resource generation. If we take a closer look at the bottom left-hand corner of our cards, we can see different symbols depending on the card. If you use a card in order to generate resources with it, you will generate as many resources as the card has symbols. Most of the time a card has one symbol, but if we take a look at Genius, we can see that there are cards that have more than one symbol. So, we could use Heroic Intuition and Swinging Web Kick for example to pay for the cost of Black Cat, or we could just use Genius, since that card generates 2 resources and not just 1. If we use a card this way, we will ignore anything else that is printed on that card and put it straight into the discard pile. So, if we would use Swinging Web Kick as a resource to play another card for example, we would ignore its printed text. There are exceptions for that, but I will cover them just in a moment. There are 4 different resource types, each one comes with its own name. Physical, Energy, Mental, and Wild. If you want to pay for the cost of a card, indicated by the number on the top left corner, then it doesn't matter which of these 4 symbols is printed on a card. But of course, there are situations where the resource type you generate does matter. After all, there would be no reason to introduce different resource types in the first place if there wasn't. We will cover some of them just in a moment. But before that, there's something important to say about wild resources. This resource type is kind of a joker, since you can use it as any of the other resources if you want to. So if you ever asked to generate a mental resource for example, you can do so using a card that generates a wild resource as well. But this does not mean that wild is not its own resource type. It is. There are cards that explicitly request wild resources. If you listen closely, you recall that I said that there are more ways to generate resources than through discarding cards with resource symbols printed on them. There are cards that can generate resources via their abilities. Take a look at Peter Parker for example. He reads Scientist, Resource, Generate a mental resource. Limited once per turn. The Scientist is just flavor text and has no meaning inside of the game itself. This holds true for all ability names printed in italics on all cards. This text only matters if another card explicitly refers to it. One example for that is the hero form of Miles Morales, which has 2 abilities, Venom Blast and Spider Camouflage. He also comes with cards that tell you to activate those abilities. But still, even then, the name of the ability has no effect in and of itself. The same cannot be said about the next word, which is printed in bold letters. Every card that has resource printed on it does generate resources in one way or another. If a word is printed in bold letters, then it is an ability and thus has an effect on the game. We will cover all existing ability types in this video. But for now, let's concentrate on the ability resource. If a card has this ability, you can use it to generate resources that you can use to pay for a cost that requires it. For example, paying the cost on the top left corner of a card. It is important to note here that you cannot, through any method, generate resources in order to spend them later on. You only can generate resources in the moment a cost has to be paid and in order to pay for it. There's nothing comparable to floating mana in this game if you are familiar with Magic the Gathering. So you cannot activate Peter Parker's ability, generate a mental resource and then decide what cost you are paying for it, or even flip to the hero side of your identity and use the mental resource then. We have another card in our hand that can generate resources. Web Shooter. Let's break this card into 2 parts. First, it has the keyword uses printed on it, typical for early cards with an explanation what that keyword does. I will shortly explain a keyword if it appears in this video, but if you want to have an all-encompassing overview of all the existing keywords and their intricate roots, you can now find a link to our video in the top right corner or in this video's description. The uses keyword is straightforward though. Web Shooter, for example, comes into play with 3 web counters, and every time you use its resource ability, you have to spend one of those counters, meaning that if you use that ability thrice, the card will be discarded. As was the case with the ability names in italics, the way the counters on cards are named has no effect on gameplay. All uses counters of all player cards are interchangeable, and their names are just for flavor. Thus you can use the same token for all of them. The second part of Web Shooter is a hero resource ability, which reads that you have to first exhaust the card and second remove one counter from it. If you do both, you generate a wild resource. It is important that you fulfill everything a card asks of you when you try to resolve an ability that contains an error. If you can only partially resolve the text before the arrow, you will not resolve anything after the arrow. WebShooter does ask you to exhaust that card. What is that? To exhaust a card means to put it sideways. If a card is exhausted, it cannot be exhausted another time until it is readied again, meaning that it is put upright again. This automatically happens every round after the last player ended their player phase, but we will come to that later. Let's get back to the text printed in bold. If you take a closer look, there is a difference between this card and Peter Parker. On Peter Parker it simply states resource, and on WebShooter it says hero resource. Most abilities require of you to be in a specific form. For most identities there are exactly two forms, alter ego and hero. That means that you can only use WebShooter's resource ability while you are in hero form, so we could not use it right now. But that doesn't mean that we couldn't play the card now. That we can do if we want to. With Aunt May, we do have a card in hand that can only use its ability while we are in alter ego mode. This card has an action ability, so let's talk about action abilities now. This actually covers the next point on the player phase reference. Action abilities are the most common ones and they are very diverse. So diverse in fact that it doesn't make sense to even try to list all of them. All you really need to know is that they have one very special feature no other ability type has. In multiplayer you can request other players to activate an action ability of theirs while it's your turn. This not only includes cards with an action ability that already are on the field, but also cards in their hand that trigger an action ability upon being played. But you have to be careful here. The action ability of that card really has to be activated by being played and not afterwards. So if you would play in multiplayer right now and it would be another player's turn, they could not request us to play Aunt May from our hand in order to heal our identity. But what they could do is requesting us to play and activate Swinging Web Kick, assuming that we are in hero form right now of course. Contrary to Aunt May, playing Swinging Web Kick equals activating its hero action ability, and thus can be requested. Aunt May's alter ego action ability can only be requested if she already is on the board. How do you know if an action ability is being activated by its card being played? It's quite easy actually. Player cards come in 5 types: allies, events, resources, supports, and upgrades, always being indicated right under the title of a card. Allies are other characters that you can play in order to have them face the enemy with you. Black Cat is an example for an ally. They come with their own stats and they will remain on the board for a varying amount of time. We will look at them just in a moment. Events are cards that do not really hit the board. They have one-time effects and will be put on the discard pile the moment their ability is resolved. The same goes for resource cards, but resource cards have their own special ruling, which I already hinted toward. Resource cards never have a cost printed on the top left corner. This is because their sole purpose is being used as resources in order to pay the cost for other cards. But still, many resource cards do have text on them. I told you that you have to ignore the text of a card if you use it in order to pay for the cost of something else. Resource cards are the exception to that rule. Let's take a look at the Power of Justice for example, a card that is in our deck. It reads that the number of resources it generates while playing for Justice cards is doubled. So this cards act as a double resource card but only for yellow cards. And while we are at it, let's point out that you are allowed to assign both white resources this card generates to whatever combination of resource types you want to. They don't have to be the same. Supports on the other hand are being played on the board and generally will stay there, until they are removed through an effect. Upgrades are much the same. They hit the board and generally stay there for an extended period. The main difference between supports and upgrades is that upgrades are considered as part of the identity, in this case Spider-Man, while supports aren't. Well, there are upgrades that you put on allies and those are not considered being part of the identity, but I think that goes without saying. There are circumstances in which it matters whether you did something or a support/ally of yours. Such a situation will not come up in this video, but still it is good if you know and keep in mind that there is a difference. Just remember that when a card says that X happens if you did something, that means that your identity had to do that thing and not an ally or support of yours. Since I already talked about changing form, let's cover the 4th point on the reference sheet in order to talk about the 3rd one. Once per round you can change your form. For us that means once per round we can change from Peter Parker to Spider-Man or from Spider-Man to Peter Parker. But we cannot change from Peter Parker to Spider-Man and then back to Peter Parker all in one round. At least not without a card that enables additional form switches. Your identity does not have to be ready in order to be able to change form. If it is exhausted, you still can change form, but your identity will stay exhausted even after switching form. And while I'm already talking about being exhausted, and because these questions come up all the time, if an ability does not explicitly state that a card must be exhausted in order to activate the ability, you do not need to exhaust the card. So you can use Peter Parker's resource ability without exhausting him. But you have to exhaust Web Shooter in order to activate its ability. Alright, let's get back to form changing and let's flip Peter Parker on its hero side. The first thing that will catch the eye are the different colors and numbers on the left side of the card. These are the values of Spider-Man's basic powers. Every identity has 4 of them, and we already saw the 4th one on Peter Parker. But let's talk about the basic powers of the hero side first. The red one in the middle represents Spider-Man's attack value. If you use Spider-Man's basic attack, you will damage his target for 2 damage. The green one represents his defense. If an enemy attacks Spider-Man, he can use his basic defense to reduce the incoming damage by the value printed here. So, in our case by 3. The first basic power represents Spider-Man's ability to thwart the schemes of the enemy. We will get a full understanding of what that means when we go over to the villain's phase. If we flick back to Peter Parker for a moment, we can see the yellow basic power, which represents his recovery stat. Peter Parker can use it to recover up to 3 hit points. So, how can we use the basic power of an identity? That's very simple. You just have to exhaust it. So you can, for example, exhaust Spider-Man either to attack or to thwart. You cannot do both in the same round. At least not if you don't have a way to ready him again. Alright, if we take another look at Black Cat, we now can understand the stats on her as well. She can use her basic power either to thwart or to attack. The number on the middle right represents her hit points. If she gets hit with 2 or more damage, she will be discarded. But that's not all that is important for allies. If we take a closer look at her basic thwart ability, we can see this sign. This represents how much damage an ally gets after they use the corresponding basic power. This damage is called consequential damage. So, if you use Black Cat's basic power to thwart, she will get 1 damage after the thwart resolves. But note that she does not get any consequential damage when she attacks. This is really rare and quite powerful. Allies would be really overpowered if they would never leave the field once being played. Because of that, there is consequential damage. Another stipulation upon allies is that every player can only have 3 allies in play at the same time. If you played a 4th one, you immediately would have to choose one of those for allies and discard it. Well, with that you know everything you need to know in order to play your turns in Marvel Champions. Now we are actually going to play our first turn and explain a couple more things. So let's flip back to Peter Parker. If we take a look at our cards, we can see that we actually already talked about all of them except for Heroic Intuition. I will do that just in a moment, but not before we change it to hero form. But before we are going to do that, we should make sure that we use Peter Parker's resource ability first, since it basically is one free resource that would otherwise go to waste. I would advise you to always plan out your whole turn before you start doing anything. While this is not a competitive game player versus player, and there's nothing wrong with taking back any actions, sometimes it is hard to reverse plays that already happened. So, in order to avoid that, I already planned out the complete turn, but for the purpose of explaining, I will only tell you everything I do when I actually do it. The first thing we are going to do is to use Peter Parker's resource ability in order to pay for the cost of Web Shooter. If you have trouble remembering whether you use an once per turn effect already, use a token or something to mark the card. Now, Web Shooter is put on the board and 3 counters on it. Remember that we can't use its resource ability just yet, since we are not in hero form right now. Since we are at full health, we don't have to heal ourselves through our basic power, nor do we need to play Aunt May. The next thing we are going to do is using Genius in order to pay the cost for Black Cat. Black Cat has a new ability we haven't covered yet, Forced Response. There are responses and forced responses. The main difference between these two is that for a response ability you can freely choose whether you want to activate it or not, but you must resolve the effect of a forced responsibility. Another difference is that if multiple abilities are being triggered at the same time, forced abilities always resolve before abilities that are not forced. So in our case we have to discard the top 2 cards of our deck. Now we add each card to our hand that was discarded this way and that has at least 1 mental resource printed on it. So, this is an example for an effect that cares for the resource type that is printed on a card. The 2 cards we discarded are for Justice, which has an energy resource printed on it, and the Power of Justice, which has a wild resource printed on it. so we are not allowed to add any of those 2 cards to our hand. This exemplifies again that white is its own resource type. So while you can use it to generate any resource type, it still is a white resource. But Black had explicitly asked for a card that has a metal resource printed on it. But well, luckily I planned our turn without depending on getting more cards via Black Cat's ability. Now we don't have anything more to do in alter ego form. So let's use our freeform switch and switch into hero form. What are our options now? We could play Aunt May, which doesn't make a lot of sense right now since we are at full health. We also could play Heroic Intuition. What does this card do? It is an upgrade that raises the value of our basic ability to thwart by 1. So if we would play it, Spider-Man would thwart for 2 instead of 1. This would be a good move, but it is not the one we are going to choose right now. The next thing I want to do is playing Swinging Web Kick. But we only have 2 other cards in hand that can only generate 1 resource each. So how can we play Swinging Web Kick that costs 3 resources? Remember that we already played Web Shooter. We can use its hero action ability to generate the missing resource. So let's do that. We exhaust Web Shooter and remove 1 web counter from it. Then we discard Aunt May and Heroic Intuition from our hand, and voila, we have generated 3 resources and can pay the cost of Swinging Web Kick. What does this card do? It is an hero action that lets us deal 8 damage to an enemy. Well, there's only 1 enemy on board, so let's target Rhino. His hit points go from 14 down to 6. But let's have a closer look at Swinging Web Kick before we discard it. We already covered that we can only play it while we are in hero form since it is an hero action ability. But note that directly after that there it says attack in brackets. In a lot of situations this word is very important. This is because a lot of cards do something if an attack occurred. If an ability states that it's an attack, then you treat it the same way as you would treat the use of the basic attack of your hero. In the same way as upgrades are considered extensions of your identity, attack actions are considered as actions of your identity as well. The same holds true for actions that are followed by thwart, defense, or recovery. It is very important to note that you do not have to exhaust your identity in order to use an action ability. You only exhaust your identity in order to use one of its basic powers, or if another effect explicitly tells you to exhaust your identity. Swinging Web Kick does not, so Spider-Man will stay ready. Directly after Swinging Web Kick resolves, it is being put on the discard pile. Now we don't have any more cards to play in our hand, so the only thing that we still can do is using the basic powers of our identity and ally. Since we cannot thwart anything yet, we are going to use both of our character's basic attack and attack Rhino. Beginning with our identity, we exhaust Spider-Man and deal 2 damage to Rhino, bringing him down to 4. Then we exhaust Black Cat and bring Rhino down to 3. After the damage is applied, we check the ally for the amount of consequential damage we have to apply to it. As we already covered, Black Cat doesn't get any consequential damage for attacking. Now there's nothing more for us to do. We have no cards in hand and all cards on board are exhausted, so we are going to end our turn for now. If we would play in multiplayer, and if we wouldn't be the last player to play our turn, the player to our left would now play out their turn next. Since we are playing solo, the game jumps to the second step of the player phase. All players simultaneously are going through the following 3 steps. If they still have cards in hand, they can choose to discard any number of them. Since we don't have any card left in our hand, we skip this step. Next, all players draw up to their hand size. Here it is important that we take another look at our identity card. That is because for nearly every identity in the game, the hand size of the alter ego form and the hero form do not match. This holds true for our identity. While Peter Parker has a hand size of 6, Spider-Man only has a hand size of 5. So we only draw 5 cards now. If we would somehow end our turn with more cards than our hand size, we would need to discard cards until the number of cards in our hand match our hand size. In the last step of the player phase, every player readies each of their exhausted cards. In our case, these are Spider-Man, Black Cat and Web Shooter. And with that, the player phase ends and the villain phase begins. The villain phase always starts with threat being placed on the main scheme. For that we have to take a look at the main scheme, in this case the break-in. Here you can see how much threat will be placed on the main scheme during this step. Since we are playing solo, only 1 threat will be placed. In the next step, the villain activates once against every player. If you are in hero form, the villain and all minions engaged with you attack you. If you are in alter ego form, the villain and all minions engaged with you scheme. Now is a great time to talk more about schemes. We have 2 lose conditions. We lose the game if the hit points of all participating players hit 0, and we lose if the last main scheme of the main scheme deck reaches its threshold value. In our case, the main scheme deck only consists of one card, so we lose the game if at any point 7 threat are being placed on the break-in at the same time. A main scheme always clearly states if its fulfillment loses you the game or not. And here you can see whether a main scheme already starts with threat on it or not. In our case, the main scheme starts without any threat already being placed on it from the start. How can we stop the main scheme from being fulfilled? One way is to defeat the villain. This is the ultimate goal of most scenarios. If we defeat the villain, we win the game. But often we cannot do this quickly enough, because the villain finishes the main scheme before we can defeat him. In order to not let that happen, we can thwart the schemes of the villain. One way to do so is by using our basic power to thwart. If we do that, we simply remove as much threat from the scheme as the value of our basic thwart power indicates. Of course, there are other ways to thwart schemes, just as there are other ways to damage the villain. Alright, let's go back to the action. Since we are in hero form, the villain is going to attack us. But before this happens, we have to take a look at Spider-Man. He has an interrupt ability. This is yet another ability kind that, most fittingly named, interrupts whatever step would normally occur. Before, or in some cases instead, of what normally would occur, the interrupt ability occurs. In our case, since Rhino initiated an attack against us, we draw one card. This ability of Spider-Man could be triggered multiple times in the same turn. After this interrupt ability is resolved, Rhino continues his attack. For that, the top card of the encounter deck is put face down next to the villain. This card is called a boost card, and it will modify the attack value of Rhino. If we were in alter ego form, Rhino would also get one boost card that modifies his scheme value. Before we flip the boost card over, in order to see by how much the attack value of Rhino is boosted, we have to make a decision. We must decide whether we are going to use our basic power to defend against this attack. If we choose to do so, we now would have to exhaust Spider-Man. The incoming damage would then be reduced by our defense value, meaning 3. Instead, we could also use an ally to defend against an incoming attack. If we choose to do so, we also would have to exhaust that ally. Since allies don't have a defense stat, they will be hit by the full force of the incoming attack. But it's important to note that normally, if an ally defends an attack and is being defeated by that attack, the damage that exceeds the hit points of that ally is not applied to the hero. So, if Rhino would attack with, let's say, a value of 8, and we would defend with Black Cat, Spider-Man would take no damage. At least most of the time. There's a keyword which does apply the difference of the hit points of the ally and the attack value of the attacker onto the identity. But okay, let's go back to our case. Well, before that, let's just note that if you would play in multiplayer, another player that is not the target of the attack can also defend the incoming attack, either with their allies or with their hero. If they choose to defend with their hero, they also have to exhaust it. But we decide not to defend this attack. There are cards that we could play right now before we flip over the boost card, but we have none of those in the deck. Just make sure to play them before you flip over the boost card. This is what we are going to do now. The boost card is Stampede. Boost cards more or less work exactly as cards that we use in order to pay for the cost of another card, meaning that we ignore nearly everything that is written on that card. Instead, we exclusively check the bottom right corner of the card and look for the icons that are printed there. For every icon that looks like this one, the attack of the villain is being boosted by 1. So in this case, Rhino's attack is being boosted by 1 and he attacks us with a value of 3 instead of 2. If he would have schemed, he now would have schemed for 2 instead of 1. But there's another symbol that can appear on the bottom right corner of a boost card, namely this one. While the first symbol was called a boost icon, this symbol is called a star icon. Star icons are not being considered boost icons and thus do not modify the value of the power the villain uses. Instead, they signal that the boost card has a boost ability, which is only being activated if the card is being flipped over as a boost card. Actually, there is no card with a star icon in this scenario, but if we would play against Claw instead, we could stumble upon Weapons Runner. This card has the boost ability that you would have to put it into play engaged with you. If you would do that, you still would ignore the rest of the text printed on the card. So, in this case, you would not search. If you have to put a card into play engaged with you, that means that it is in battle with you and no one else. So, if Weapons Runner would use one of its basic powers, it would use them against you and no one else. The last thing I want to explain with this example is that in this step of the villain phase, not only the villain activates against you, meaning either attacking or scheming. but all minions engage with you as well. This does include any minions that are being put into play as a result of the villain's activation against you as well. So in this case, Weapon Stealer would attack you as well. This window actually only closes after the last minion was activated against you. But let's get back to our actual board state. The boost card we drew boosts Rhino's attack by 1, so now we have to apply 3 damage to our identity. Here, the defense value of our hero does not matter, and since we already revealed the boost card, we could no longer change our mind and choose to use our basic power to defend after all. But we actually have a card in our hand that can prevent us from taking any damage. Backflip has an interrupt ability that lets us prevent all damage from one attack. Notice that like swinging web kick, this ability also counts as something our identity does. It's a defense. But as was the case with swinging web kick, if we would choose to use backflip right now, we would not need to exhaust Spider-Man for that. The important thing to note here is that there are cards that can only be activated if you defend it against an attack. Using backflip or other cards that are being considered as defenses fulfill that condition, and because we used backflip, we could for example use counterpunch. We are not using backflip here though, because of 2 reasons. On the one hand, because 3 damage is not that much. On the other, because we might want to play one of the more costly cards in our hand. If we would use backflip right now, we could not use it in order to pay for the cost of another card. This is something you always should consider. So we take the damage and go down to 7 HP. Now every minion engaged with us would attack us as well. Since there are no minions engaged with us, nothing happens and we can go to step 3 of the villain phase. This is the most thrilling one. We have to deal an encounter card to each player in player order, beginning with the first player. This is not unlike how we just put the top card of the encounter deck face down next to the villain, but instead of putting it next to the villain, now we put the card next to us. After we did so, we proceed to the 4th step of the villain phase. Each player rereads and reserves the encounter cards in player order. It is important to note here that the word reveals carry a lot of weight in Marvel Champions. There are a couple of ways you can flip a card face up, but this is not always considered as a reveal. For example, when we flipped the boost card in step 2 of the villain phase face up, the boost card was not revealed. A card is only being revealed in step 4 of the villain phase, or if the ability of a card explicitly orders you to reveal another card. This ruling is the source of a lot of confusion for beginners, so try to keep it in mind. So let's reveal our encounter card. It is Shocker, a minion. It now engages us. It also has an when we read ability which reads that it deals 1 damage to each hero. So it does deal 1 damage to us, bringing us down to 6 hit points. Since we are not in step 2 of the villain phase anymore, Shocker will not attack us this villain phase. If we would get any more encounter cards while still being in step 4 of the villain phase, we would also reveal them. Except if we would play a multiplayer and we draw another encounter card after we already revealed our encounter cards and passed over to the next player. But alright. If we reserved every encounter card and if we would play multiplayer, we now would go to the 5th and last step of the villain phase and pass the first player token clockwise. And that's it, the first round of Marvel Champions is over. Now we simply start with the first step of the player phase. But for that you don't need me anymore. Well, there are 4 last things I'm going to tell you. The first thing is a win condition of most scenarios. You win the scenario if the hit points of the villain reach 0. You might think that we already are close to that because Rhino only has 4 hit points remaining. This is deceiving since when we defeat this stage of the villain, the next one will get revealed and the hit points of the villain will be filled up to the noted value on the bottom of the card. In our case, Rhino would get up to 15 hit points. It is important to note that if you defeat the first stage of a villain with more damage than they have hit points left, the excess damage does not transfer to the next stage of the villain. It gets wasted instead. If the next stage of a villain is reached, the villain card is considered being revealed. So in this case, Rhino's when revealed effect would be triggered. Only after you defeated the last villain of the villain deck, you win the scenario. As I told you, the villain wins if the last main scheme in the main scheme reaches its threshold value. In this case, 7th threat. But besides main schemes, there are also side schemes. If we take a look at the when revealed effect of the second stage of Rhino, we see that we are being instructed to put a side scheme into play. Namely Breaking and Taken. The main difference between side schemes and main schemes is that side schemes generally don't have a maximum threshold value, which they are not allowed to reach. Instead, they come into play with threat already being put on them. If you remove all threat from a side scheme, for example through thwarting, then you discard that side scheme. So side schemes can be defeated and being discarded. While we are at the discard pile of the encounter deck, if the match goes on for long enough, it might happen that the encounter deck runs out of cards. If that happens, you simply shuffle the encounter deck discard pile into a new encounter deck and resume from there. But this comes with a price. Every time you go through the encounter deck, you get a permanent acceleration token. Every acceleration token adds 1 threat to the total threat that you have to put on the main scheme at step 1 of the villain's phase. So, no matter how good you are at thwarting, there will be a point at which you will automatically lose. In this case, when there are 6 acceleration tokens in play, since then you would have to put 7 threat on the main scheme while at step 1 of the villain's phase. But the match will not take that long, this I can assure you. You already know that if you go through all of your player deck, you also just shuffle your discard pile into a new deck and proceed from there. Well, this also comes with a negative side effect. Every time you empty your deck, you have to deal yourself 1 encounter card from the encounter deck. So, the same thing that happens at step 3 of every villain's phase. While the encounter card will be dealt to you immediately, you still only reveal it the next time you are in step 4 of the villain phase. The only exception is if you already are in step 4 of the villain phase. Then you reveal this encounter card after you revealed all encounter cards that got dealt to you before that. Alright, now you really know everything you need to know in order to play this great game. I know that this was a lot. And while some of the more intricate rules of this game will confuse you from time to time, most of the things you learned just now will become second nature in no time. There are a lot of things I did not cover here, but these mostly are smaller things that are not happening in every game and simply would be overkill to also cover here. This already was quite enough. But no worries, the rules reference book is really good and chances are I covered the questions you have in another of my videos. You might consider subscribing to my channel just to prepare for that. Or maybe you want to see a full game of all the scenarios that come with the core set. I have you covered. But independent of that, I hope that I could help you understand the rules of this great game. I really love Marvel Champions and welcome you into our community. I hope you like it as well and will stay for the long run. For now, I wish you a fantastic rest of your day. Take care.